Thank you for tuning in to the Into the Classroom series produced by Mental Health California, sponsored by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our session of Into the Classroom, which is a student mental health awareness multimedia series produced by Mental Health California. I'm your host, Conrad Crump, affectionately known as Coach Crump, and for today's topic, we'll be talking about understanding trauma in high school and college students. I'm looking forward to a pretty informative discussion today where we will dive into the topics of sustaining trauma, exploring ways to deal with it, and how to heal through traditional, cultural, and holistic methods. We will have a thought provoking discussion with students and experts who will share with us their insights and experiences. Now, today, we're helping young people discover the power of cultural connections, self care practices, and holistic approaches in their journey towards healing from trauma. At this time, I'd like to introduce our guest today. We're joined by a fantastic brother named Christian Jacobs, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a leading Brother Be Well clinical advisor. Christian is a noted therapist who also has significant experience in substance use prevention. His depth of knowledge benefits youth and their families throughout California. Christian, how you doing today, man?
How's it going, Coach Crump? Glad to join you today.
Likewise, all is well, all is well. I'd also like to take the time to introduce our youth guests for today's episode. With us, we have Meant to Be Craig from CK McClatchy High School. What's
Hello.
up, Meant to Be? Hey there, how you doing?
I am doing fine. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Awesome. We also have Michael Betlock from Sacramento State University. What's good, Michael? How you doing?
What's up, Coach Crump?
Hey, man, good to see you again. And then we also have, certainly last but not least, Mr. Keyshawn Williams from Sac State University. Welcome, Keyshawn.
How you doing, Coach? Good to see you.
Doing great. Good to see you too. Now, before we dive into our discussion, I'd actually like to ask our clinician, Mr. Jacobs, if he could provide some brief clinical insights on trauma, specifically relating to youth.
Hey, Conrad, that's a good question. You know, when it comes to trauma in youth, it's really important because trauma affects the youth, or we'll say someone from age 5 to 25, differently than it does an adult. So someone who's 25 and older, an older adult, and that's because the brain is still developing. So that's the interesting part about trauma, is that when someone who's an adolescent or a child or even a young adult for that matter, it affects them much differently because when that trauma hits the brain and you experience some of that, some of the PTSD, for example, a lot of those symptoms just affect the body much differently. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit more later in terms of how it affects the body, but it does affect the body much more significantly, which after that comes physical issues and things of that sort. So if you remember anything, remember that when it comes to trauma, you really have an issue when it comes to how to process that as a youth, because the brain is still developing and is taking on additional work. It's working that much harder. So that's the main difference between trauma, for someone who's much younger, 5 years old to 25, to someone whose brain is developed after the age of 25, going to 20, 30, or 40 years old, or even older actually.
Wow. Yeah, no, thanks for that analysis, Christian. That's great. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at our slide presentation to better understand trauma in high school and college students and how to navigate a path to healing. So as we go into our slide deck, we understand, Christian was able to give us a bit of an overview of the trauma high school students and college students, young folks face. But as we look to better understand this trauma, I'd like to ask our youth participants, just by a show of hands, how many of you have experienced or endured a different type or different form of trauma? And I'll raise my hand as well in there. So it's not surprising. As we look at our statistic, according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, 1 out of 4 children and adolescents will experience at least one traumatic event in their lives before the age of 16. Now, Michael, I saw you raise your hand earlier. Without going into any specifics or into any detail, would you care to share how the traumatic experience made you feel and what effect it may have had on you?
It had a huge effect. The specific traumatic experience that had happened in my life, it was when I was much younger, so it had a strong event, just on my mental, and during school as well. I had lost just a lot of want to do anything. I felt stuck, just didn't have motivation to do anything in school, didn't have motivation to talk to anybody. And it was a real isolating experience to where I just didn't feel like myself.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Michael. I really appreciate, you opening up. And as we know, as we've just heard from Michael, it had an impact on him when it came to his, performance, his desire, and his emotional well-being as well. Let's go ahead and go on into our next slide. So again, these impacts can have significant ways in which they, change young folks, and as they're developing, as we've heard Christian just say, the brain is still developing, so it can significantly impact our young folks and how they grow and develop in this world. Let's go on into our next slide. Now, we have here different types of trauma. Trauma can range from, acute to chronic to complex to even developmental. I'd like to ask our licensed clinician, Mr. Christian Jacobs, can you talk with us about the emotional and psychological consequences of trauma and maybe what some of those types of trauma can look like and their effects?
Yeah, Coach Crump, one thing I want to mention too about trauma is that this is a good way to remember what trauma is about. So trauma is really a traumatic event. So the C as trauma, right? And then the R, you're looking at more of a re-experiencing. So the flashbacks and the memory and things of that sort. And then when you're looking at other areas, that A is more the avoidance. So there's an avoidance factor to trauma. So you want to avoid that person, that man, that woman, that store, that that house. So that's the A. And then there's the U part, which is unable to function. So then that U part is, you're not able to, wake up every day and, take a bath or, go and hang out or things of that sort with your friends. And then the M, this is important because this is the duration. M stands for at least a month. So for folks to be diagnosed with PTSD, that there's a 1 month window in that diagnosis. And then the A is arousal. So arousal means when you go to a certain area and when you smell things, it reminds you of where that trauma happened. So those are some of the consequential. As you see, the consequences are it affects your mind, body, spirit, physically and mentally. It affects everything from your smell, how you smell things. It brings back memories to locations and environments. So it has significant impacts on the whole person. And some of the other areas we talked about too is just looking at, chronic trauma. Chronic trauma means it happens over and it doesn't go anywhere, right? So chronic means, like it says there, prolonged exposure to distressing situations. So every time you go, to your aunt's house, where the trauma occurred, you're going to experience some type of emotion that you don't like. And then you see the other one, the very first, acute is like the earlier one, where it comes and it goes. So it may not be long term or temporary. And then, of course, and there's another one here that's not on here, is secondary trauma. So secondary trauma, this is a very important too. Trauma can happen if it didn't happen to you. So social media, when you like read some of the blogs, and you see, oh, so and so got in a car accident, or a person was deceased or died by suicide. Just by you watching and hearing it, witnessing it, you can also experience trauma that way. So that's something that's really new in the research. So there's just a few areas where how it impacts you mentally and physically.
Wow. Yeah, very informative. Very informative. Christian, I appreciate that insight. I'd like to pivot and ask some of our young folks that are currently on the call, just in terms of some of those types of traumas that we've heard from, with regards to what Mr. Jacobs was explaining. Keyshawn, I'd like to ask you, with regards to the types of trauma you've heard, are there any reactions or thoughts that you might have with some of the things that Christian was speaking about?
Yeah, definitely. The one that comes to mind most often for me is probably acute trauma, and I wouldn't have known that before Christian explained it that way. But definitely having one traumatic incident, and then for a long extended period of time, you find yourself trying to act differently, trying to dress differently, trying to avoid a trigger, trying to stay away from the one situation that might have triggered a traumatic response within you. And it's crazy to hear him explain all of those, because it makes me think back and look in my life and see when a certain thing had occurred and then how it had affected me for years to come, even though it was seemingly a small incident.
Wow. Yeah, definitely is lasting. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. As we, understand that these different types of trauma can have, these consequences on us emotionally and psychologically. I heard Christian talk about PTSD, and even some of which you were talking about, Christian, with regards to depression and avoidance. I know that me personally, I had a situation where I lost a family member to gun violence, and I didn't want to go in the area where it happened. So these are all things that can impact us as a young person on our emotional and psychological well-being. Let's go ahead and go on to our next slide. So as we are looking at this slide, according to the National Center for PTSD, they estimate that approximately 15 to 43% of girls and 14 to 43% of boys have experienced at least one traumatic event. I mean, I just know that the range is nearly, it's gone from 15 to nearly half, almost 50% in each category, which means a lot of people have experienced traumatic events. So that's something that we definitely, I mean, even at the beginning when we all raised our hands, it's not like only one of us have had a traumatic event. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. So when we look at the trauma, and we know that these forms of trauma can impair a student's ability to concentrate, retain information, hinder their ability to just succeed, even when Christian was talking about that motivation and lack of it based off of the experience or the event. Some of these things that also can hinder is also like attending classes or engaging in school activities. All these different things can have an emotional toll on us. And we also know it is especially true for our LGBTQ plus youth, who also experience trauma due to discrimination, bullying, and rejection. Let's go ahead and go on to our next slide. Now, when it comes to behavioral changes, we see that trauma in young folks can show up in many different ways, as we've just heard from Christian. This includes anger, irritability, even having conflicts with authoritative figures, or even engaging in self-destructive behaviors. By a show of hands, let me ask folks that are here in this space with me right now, have any of you seen these types of behaviors from some of your peers at school? Yeah, not far-fetched. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. So, Christian, I'd love for you to jump back in here. Would you just mind briefly elaborating on what some of those behavioral changes might look like in youth, and what maybe some of the emotional and physical symptoms of untreated trauma might look like?
Yeah, I think that's a important thing to share, because first we have to understand how the brain is wired, right? So our brains are wired for connection, right? But trauma kind of rewires them for protection. So I'll say that again. So our brains are initially wired for connection, socializing, relationships, love, connection, right? But then trauma kind of rewires our brain. So it teaches your brain to go into protection mode, cut people off, isolation, stay away, avoid, So with that being said, what are some symptoms that come up from that? Well, first of all, there's, emotional. So the isolation, not being around your friends, not wanting to hang out. And here's the number one thing, not finding pleasure in the things you used to enjoy. So that's the number one thing. If you ever wonder, like, man, am I experiencing any type of trauma? That's one thing to look at. If you love playing basketball, whatever, and hanging out with your friends, and all of a sudden you're not doing it, that's another way that you want to kind of consider, So, and then the other part is this: when that brain is rewired, it's triggering emotional responses that you can't control. So sometimes people are really quick to like fire off and be mad, or they go from 0 to 100 super quick. You're like, whoa, what happened? Well, that's because the brain is rewired for protection, and it's not rewired for connection and love and letting people know that it's okay. So just remember that. So when you see people who grew up in like grew up in the hood, or grew up in a rough neighborhood, every time like a car comes by, they're looking over their shoulder, or they're watching everyone that comes to the door at the restaurant, or they have to sit with their back to the wall when they go somewhere. Their brains have been rewired for protection.
Wow, that's so true. Yeah, so true. Thank you so much, Christian, for that analysis. Let's go ahead and go on to our next slide. I definitely want to touch on this because I feel it's crucially important for us, as well as our young folks, to be able to heal from the trauma that we faced or may have experienced, even if some folks may not want to. I'd like to ask, one of our participants here that are on the call, let's go with you, Michael. What may prevent a young person from seeking the help that they may need when it comes to addressing and healing from the trauma they faced?
Yeah, I'd say for young people in particular, it's got to be embarrassment, embarrassment, or maybe a lack of even knowing that they're going through something, because as a young person, you really don't spend that time that you need to really sit and just feel and, go through your thoughts and just put feelings to paper in a sense, So I feel like that's a big part of it, of not really knowing what's going on with yourself, not knowing if you're going through trauma, if you're going through a harsh experience that's having an effect on you, and as well as embarrassment, because let's say something had happened to you and there's nobody around you who that has happened to before, so it can be real embarrassing kind of in a sense to just try to be open about that or even address it. Some people might just want to put it down and leave it to be and think that, nothing's going to happen in the future with it.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that insight, Michael. Meant to be, I feel like you might have some insight on this one. You got any thoughts on this?
Yes, I would say the lack of knowing that they have the support. A lot of people feel like they can't go to anyone or trust anyone with the information, and they rather much keep it inside. I would piggyback off of what Michael said. Judgment, embarrassment. So they might feel like, okay, I don't really want to go to anyone. I don't even know I can get access to that help. Or they may be thinking it's too expensive, or they can't use other alternative routes to get that help. So yeah, I think it's just the lack of knowing that they have support.
Wonderful. And how about you, Keyshawn? I don't want to leave you out.
Yeah,
Any
I
thoughts?
think what they both said was great. I would agree about the embarrassment thing. I would add that to have trauma from something is to have an enlarged response from a specific event. So the embarrassment could come from maybe you've heard a friend or a family member go through something that is the same or similar, and they're thinking, oh, this is not a big deal at all. They're expressing how this doesn't matter to them, or this just dirt off their shoulder. And you might be thinking in your brain, wow, this changed how I lived my life completely. So I think the embarrassment stems from that, because you think, wow, why is everybody else feeling as if this is a small thing and feeling like maybe I'm weak for thinking this is a big thing in my life?
Sure, sure. No, thank you all for that wonderful feedback. Much appreciated. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. So, you kind of touched on this, meant to be talking about having the support, that environment. I know that it is really important for youth to get the support that they need. And as we know, having a comprehensive approach is really important to getting our youth the best care possible. Michael, can you give me an idea of what a supportive environment might look like?
Yeah, I feel like a supportive environment is just somewhere where you feel comfortable speaking and being truthful, being around people who you feel like you can be yourself with. For example, like Brother Be Well, the summer program where we had a group of young men together who had shared experiences and just felt comfortable explaining, certain traumas or certain things they were going through. So I feel like when you can find yourself a little group, or just even a specific person to where you feel there's that connection where you can truly be your true self, that's when you can have those real conversations and that those real great support systems.
Awesome. Wonderful. And let's go ahead and go on to our next slide. So clearly seeking professional help is something that, can be beneficial. Christian, we've heard some real life experiences, some recommendations, some thoughts from our youth participants here. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe elaborate for some of us what some of those effective, support systems might look like, as well as what self-care might look like. What are some strategies or tips for our young folks to get them the help that they may need?
Well, I think the first thing to mention, what everyone was talking about is culture, right? So trauma affects us differently, people of color, right? Black and brown folks. It affects us differently than it would impact, someone who's not maybe a person of color. And that's because of the historical, how trauma has impacted us through our epigenetics. Epigenetics means outside of a gene. Epi, E-P-I, outside, genetic, gene. So that means it's not part of your gene, but it really sure and heck has an influence on your gene. For example, if someone back in the 1800s in slavery was constantly running from slave owners, things of that sense, by behavior, it's going to pass down through the trait of that fear. So it's epigenetics. So that's the first thing: understanding your culture, understanding where the trauma lies, so you can get assistance in that area. Second part is looking for a culturally competent person to help you. So someone who understands that historical part of your history, and that's not just race, but that's identity too. So LGBTQ groups or affinity groups. So trans groups. You want to hone in onto the areas of belonging. I heard people say that too. A place where I can feel wanted. And the next part, you want to go in there and advocating for yourself. So knowing where your traumas lie, not understanding fully, but knowing that there are some there, and you want to work with someone who has experience in that area. So if say if it was family trauma, you want someone who has family experience and trauma in that area. And we talked about this before. EMDR, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it's a type of therapy that helps people who experience trauma in a significant way. And those are just a few ways to kind of really look and see where would you start at in terms of seeking help.
Awesome. And let's go on ahead and go to our next slide, because there's also self-care. Now, self-care is important. There's mindfulness, there's meditation, breathing, all types of different types of self-care. I'd like to ask our young folks, if you can maybe just give me one self-care strategy that you personally use, and share it with the folks who are listening today. And I'll start off with you, Keyshawn.
For me, I think is journaling, actually, is being able to put my thoughts down onto a page and get them swirling outside of my head. And you can read them back to yourself and you could start to see, okay, how was I feeling when I wrote this? If someone else said this to me, would I just say, that's not really that big of a deal, in a supportive way? And so it allows me to put my thoughts down on a page and sort of process them a little bit better.
Awesome. And I heard you say that was journaling, correct? Wonderful. Thank you for that. And let's go with you, Meant to Be. What are some self-care strategies that you utilize?
Yoga has become my new favorite. It has taught me to breathe. When you breathe, you're able to experience and feel everything and every part of what you're feeling. So by learning how to breathe, I'm able to say, hey, I'm not feeling the best today. I know why, and let me breathe to find out why. So yoga is really relaxing, and it's actually really exercise. It's really energetic too. So you're able to kind of get that exercise and that that mindfulness at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for that. With that being said, you all, we've heard some outstanding thoughts, recommendations, tips, feedback. And I want to thank each and every one of you just for being here, for being vulnerable, and taking the time to share with us today. Thank you again, Christian, for all your insight, your wisdom. I feel like I learn so much, and every time we hold space together, I'm learning something new. So it's always a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for taking the time. I also want to specifically take the time to thank you, Meant to Be, just for sharing some of your thoughts and your experiences as well. I'd like to thank you, Keyshawn, just for always showing up and providing that insight. And of course, Michael Betlock, my brother, Be Well brother, all the time, man. You come with some great insight and I appreciate you. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your time. And I'd also like to give a huge thank you to you, our audience, for joining us on this Into the Classroom session, which is a production of Mental Health California. Please be sure to visit us at mentalhealthca.org, and also to access health and mental wellness topics for boys and men of color. Please visit our signature initiative at brotherbewell.com, and please be sure to also subscribe to our blog. I'd again like to thank everyone on the call, and also would like to give a special shout out to our sponsor and a thank you to our sponsor, Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative, which promotes access to mental health support. You can learn more about their program at bluesky.blueshield.com. And with that wraps up another Into the Classroom session. I'm your host, Coach Crump. Until next time, take good care.